There is a power in the nightmare. I was thinking about this upcoming panel, and I remembered that actually one of the things that got me dedicated to working on environmental issues in the first place was in 2005 or so, when Al Gore told us we had 10 years to solve climate change. And I say that semi-sarcastically, of course, almost 20 years later, but sincerely as well. I'm here largely because of those very sort of proto-climate politics. And on the other hand, and I've told this story before, a few years later when the Waxman-Markey bill failed in Congress, my immediate thought was that I couldn't wait for the next Hurricane Katrina, because then all those climate deniers would get what's coming to them. And I immediately, in that moment, realized how cynical and anti-humanist a way of thinking that was. And as much as anything, dealing with that sort of cognitive dissonance and that wishing of disaster, not that wouldn't harm climate deniers, but would harm vulnerable people, of wishing that kind of disaster on people really forced me to reckon with the power of the nightmare, which as much as anything led me to what I find to be a much more sort of generative ecological politics that we now call eco-modernism. So I don't know if we're going to talk about all that, but we are going to talk about the nightmare and the dream of our ecological politics on this next panel. Please join me in welcoming them to the stage.
Well, hello all. Thanks for being here for this, what I think will be extremely lively discussion. I'm Rui Teixeira. I'm a senior fellow at the American Enterprise Institute, co-proprietor of the Liberal Patriot blog, and I occasionally write about politics. And this panel is, did we tell them about the dream? I have a dream panel to discuss this with you. We've got David Shore here, who is head of data analytics at Blue Rose Research. He conducts, I think, several trillion interviews a year trying to figure out what's going on at the American public. We've got Celinda Lake here, who's president of Lake Research Partners, one of the most well-known and best Democratic pollsters, a legend in her time. And then we have Omar Wasow, who's professor of politics at Berkeley, who specializes in the interaction of race and politics, statistical methods, and he has a sort of extremely well-known paper that came out in APSR on these issues. So, without further ado, let me just say a few more words to set the stage. I have a nightmare. So one of the most prominent lines from the Death of Environmentalism was, imagine how history would have turned out had King given an I have a nightmare speech instead. And you could argue that in the 20 years since Death of Environmentalism came down the pike, the general tenor of the climate movement has definitely leaned into that nightmare part of the approach. We've heard a lot about the nightmare. So let me just give you a few examples here. The general idea is, unless we take immediate action and drastic action to stop global warming, the Earth will be burned to a cinder and we're all going to die, and that would really be a bad thing. So you can kind of trace, I think this really gets turbocharged with Al Gore's An Inconvenient Truth movie and slideshow in 2006, showing 30-foot sea level rises, which are, shall we say, just a little bit implausible. But it definitely got people's attention. In 2008, Bill McKibben and some college graduates founded 350.org and said, basically, climate change is the most important issue facing humanity. In 2014, when Obama was promulgating a sort of all-of-the-above approach to energy and an energy transition, the Environmental Defense Fund, the League of Conservation Voters, and NRDC, Natural Resource Defense Council, and the Sierra Club, which you heard from earlier, they characterized the all-of-the-above policy as, quote, a compromise that future generations can't afford. It locks in the extraction of fossil fuels that will inevitably lead to a catastrophic climate future. Sound familiar? And then Trump comes in 2016, and after in 2017, we have the Sunrise Movement founded, whose tagline was, "We are the climate revolution." Also in that year, David Wallace Wells, who now writes for the New York Times, he had a famous New York Magazine article, "The Uninhabitable Earth," which became a best-selling book eventually. Its subhead of the article was "Famine, Economic Collapse, a Sun That Cooks Us, What Climate Change Could Wreak Sooner Than You Think." I say that's pretty catastrophic. Now, in 2018, we were all treated to the rise of Greta Thunberg, the 15-year-old Swedish activist who told the UN the following, among other things: "You stole in my dreams and my childhood with your empty words." And yet, I'm one of the lucky ones. People are suffering. People are dying. Entire ecosystems are collapsing. We're in the middle of a mass extinction. And all you can talk about is money and fairy tales of economic growth. How dare you? So I think we all remember that one. Now, in 2019, we have a very interesting kind of sea change in the way the whole climate issue was dealt with by the media. There were a number of decisions made, among other places at The Guardian, but lots of other places as well. The basic idea is climate emergency, crisis, or breakdown. That's what we have to refer to now. Not just climate change, not just global warming, but we have to use those other words, because otherwise it sounds rather passive and gentle. When what scientists, these scientists, they're talking about is a catastrophe for humanity. Last period of time, even top Democratic leaders have repeatedly and unreservedly referred to climate change as an existential threat or crisis. Biden in 2023 said, "The only existential threat humanity faces that's even more frightening than a nuclear war is global warming going above 1.5 degrees in the next 20 or 10 years, whatever." Now, that'd be real trouble. There's no way back from that. So I guess nuclear war, not such a big problem. Climate change, we're all cooked. And of course, Antonio Guterres, Secretary General of the UN, is not to be outdone on any of this stuff. He's claimed the era of global warming has ended. The era of global boiling has arrived. He said humanity has opened the gates to hell, and that's code red for humanity. And also, of course, we've seen in this period of time the rise of the Sunrise Movement, of course, but also Extinction Rebellion, Just Stop Oil, and sort of more and more sort of outrageous tactics to bring people's attention to the issue. The most recent thing just a day or two ago when they basically vandalized the Stonehenge. These are justified because, again, the hour is late. Only these tactics can work to get people's attention. So I have a nightmare indeed, is I think the tenor of much of the climate movement. This raises three questions. One, is it substantively true? Are we really on the verge of catastrophe? The second question is, well, if we tried to do what you urge us to do in terms of a super rapid transition away from fossil fuels, is it even technically feasible? Can it actually be done? And the third question is it politically feasible? And this is what we're going to get into today. Can a coalition be built around the rapid elimination of fossil fuels? And if so, is this catastrophist framing really going to do the job? Does it really work? So that's the kind of thing we're going to deal with today, trying to really dig in on the issues that are raised by this sort of general political approach that seems to hegemonize the climate movement, if not necessarily the policies of actual people who get into office and try to do stuff, but it's certainly the way the issue's framed. Is this helpful, and if not, why not? So first, we're going to turn to David Shore, who I believe has some slides for us, trying to get at, in particular, this salience issue and what messages might or might not work. So David, take it away.
Great, fantastic.
Whoops.
Oh, fantastic. All right. Very excited to give this talk. I'm going to just some context about me. I'm a pollster. We do a lot of polling. We do, he said trillions, but our actual numbers, we do about 3 million interviews a month, which is a lot. And we're going to just talk a little bit about climate as an issue. So first, this is a big table of numbers, but the basic idea is that the way that we measure what's important and what's not is that we show people two random issues, and then we just say which of these two things is more important, to the issues facing the country. And so what this shows is basically the percentage of the time that people pick that versus another issue at random. And so what you could see is that right now, the top issues are cost of living, inflation, the economy, the deficit, healthcare. Luckily, that's like a good one for Democrats, but really most of them fairly bad. But something you can look is if you look for climate change or the environment, you really have to look pretty far down. I think the environment is the 28th most important issue out of 40, and climate change is the 32nd most important issue out of 40, just in terms of what voters care about right now. So here, I'm just going to show some crosstabs. Who are the people? How does caring about climate change or the environment vary by demographic? And here I have, just for comparison, the cost of living. right now, if you ask voters what's more important, the cost of living or another issue at random, people pick cost of living 86% of the time. That's really wild. It's very hard to get 86% of people to answer anything in a survey. And this isn't a tautology. Back in early 2021, this was not true. It was like 40%. But so anyway, if you look, generally speaking, the climate change in the environment is really low for almost every single group, with the exception of people who identify as very liberal. For people who identify as very liberal, or in particular, 18 to 34-year-olds who identify as very liberal, this is the one segment of the electorate for whom climate change is actually roughly as important as the cost of living, though it's still below. Obviously, if you measure what percentage of the electorate are very liberal, it's like 5 or 6%, but that's just worth saying. And then you could see, though, that other than that, basically every single group, whether it's non-white voters or looking by age or by gender or by anything except for ideology, most voters just don't care very much about this issue right now. So here's another graph. This is, which, because it kind of gets at, when you go back here and you look at, 18 to 34-year-old Biden voters, you go, all right, well, 62%, it's not a top issue, but like young Biden voters, maybe we should talk about climate in order to turn people out. And so here we have a graph. What this shows is we're breaking out young Biden voters or young Democrats by their chance of voting. And so that's the x-axis. And the y-axis is how important people find the issue. And so what you could see is that generally speaking, the young people who care about climate change are the ones who are definitely going to vote, who have a greater than 95% chance of voting. But as you go toward the middle or toward the end, suddenly people care a lot less. And then also we have some lines here. Cost of living is number one for all groups. Gaza is at the bottom. Student debt is also close to the bottom. Housing is close to the top. In general, if you decide I want to turn out young voters and you're just trying to decide what content to put in, I feel like most people who work in politics or who do this stuff decide I'm going to start with these issues at the bottom instead of the issues at the top. And that's kind of a mistake, I think, is what I would say. But OK. So now another thing about who cares about climate. Previously, I was showing that it's highly, it's really concentrated with very liberal, hyper-engaged voters. But another thing that shows up here, what we're doing is that for every single issue, I look at how much rich Democrats care about it. Democrats who make more than $150,000 a year, and how much poor Democrats care about it. Democrats who make less than $25,000 a year. And it's rank ordered. And what you could see is that out of 40 issues, climate change has the third highest tilt toward rich Democrats out of any of these 40 issues that we've tested. Well, if you look on the other side, you see that poor Democrats care more about unemployment, poverty, gas prices, housing, Social Security, Medicare. And I feel like in our space, we are constantly asking ourselves, why are working class people leaving the Democratic Party? And I think in general, it's like a hard and tricky issue, but if you want working class Democrats to not become Republicans, you should probably talk more about the issues they care about and less about the issues that rich Democrats care about. And I think if you look at what's on the top of the list over there, it's kind of, we talk about those issues quite a bit. So now I'm going to stop talking about climate, who cares about climate, and instead I'm going to talk about how do we talk about climate, because all the people in this room care about it, and presumably we have to say something. And so the first thing, this is one of the things about our shop. We test a lot of messages. We've tested at least 160 climate messages. Probably the real answer is a lot more than that. And here we have a histogram of the distribution of average treatment effects. You could see that the very best climate message is named inflation, save on energy bills, which is kind of a theme. So first, here are the best climate messages that we've ever tested. This is a big wall of text, so I'm just gonna, the number one is you should vote for Democrats because they support the Inflation Reduction Act, which is gonna save thousands of dollars on their energy bills per year and create 9 million good-paying jobs. Then there's kitchen table cost, inflation, economic strength. If you really read into these, you'll notice that they're not really about climate. The word climate was kind of snuck as one of, 80 words, but it's really mostly about energy and jobs, which makes sense. Here are some decent ones. Replacing lead pipes You know, I keep trying to tell my other pollster friends that voters actually care about that. It is important. Clean water, lowering gas prices, all shows up, you know. And then I'm going to, here are some really bad ones. So the first one touts how the Inflation Reduction Act is going to cut climate pollution in half and reach net zero emissions by no later than 2050. It also mentions that we will reduce greenhouse gas emissions by a gigaton. Voters didn't like that. There was one talking about how big oil lied. That also doesn't do very well. And then another one that was one of the worst was talking about the Green New Deal and frontline communities. I think it's really notable that a lot of the organizations that people here don't like very much say things that look exactly like all of these messages up here. And then the other thing we do is that we also test Republican attacks against Democrats on the climate issue. And something that comes through really clearly is a lot of these arguments are very effective. You know, please don't tell the Republicans. Where, you know, just to read, you know, some of them, you know, since day one, Biden has waged war on energy independence. His failed policies, like canceling the Keystone Pipeline, have led to Americans paying higher heating costs. That is a almost 90th percentile message relative to all of the other attacks that Republicans do. And so it's just good to know, I guess. All right, I'm going to end on one. I'm going to end on one note. This is yes. So what this is. I do mean it. Please stop talking about electric cars. But I'm going to explain why. So basically, this is some testing we did around the American Jobs Plan, if anybody remembers that. And so we tested, I think this is something like a dozen different talking points about it. And what you could see is that at the top is, you know, broadband internet, trains, bridges. You know, there's some environmental ones that kind of do okay, talking about clean water and clean air and reducing the price of energy. But then the one thing that mentions electric cars and charging stations literally makes people more likely to vote for Republicans. I say this half jokingly, but only half jokingly. Like, if I had a choice between a politician touting that he helped fund, you know, get an electric car factory built, or saying that he wants to defund the police, I might pick defund. Like, in our testing, and I think this is something that a lot of pollsters see, like, voters really, really hate electric cars. So please stop talking about them. Like, you know, it's Ford's job to sell electric cars, not ours, I guess. All right, that's it. Thanks for listening to me speak.
Well, thanks, David. That was very provocative and a lot to chew on there. I think we're going to turn to Celinda now, who may have a somewhat different perspective on some of these issues. So, Celinda, give us the benefit of your wisdom.
Thank you very much. Well, thank you. And Ruth, I so apologize. And thank you for the bailout here. So I have a little different view, but I think David's data is the data. A little bit is what you do with the data. So one question I would ask is, how bad is the salience problem with climate change? And it depends a lot on what you mean by salience. So one of the things that is interesting is there is a constituency, I think it's a little bit broader than David talks about, of younger people and Democrats. And there is a changing electorate that is going to continue to make this constituency bigger and bigger. But it is true that the only group of voters who put as very, and where a majority put climate change is very important right now, is adults under 30. So it is a narrow constituency. That said, people have the ability right now to be worried about lots of things at once. If we asked some of the questions that David was asking about the abortion issue, for example, you would have a huge number of voters saying that cost of living is much more important than abortion. And only 9% saying abortion is the most important problem facing the country right now, the most important problem for the president to deal with. On the other hand, if you ask people, what is your most important voting issue? Among women, 46% say climate change and 46% say abortion. So what people think of as overall dominant issue, and what they might take to the voting booth, what might motivate them to vote. For example, youth turnout, a very, very big issue now. Climate change plays a very big role in that. And it also depends on how you talk about the issue. When we talk about, and you see in David's data, pollution to the air we breathe, water we drink, extreme weather, it's far more salient to a broader group of people. So part of our problem with salience is we talk about a very large, complex, abstract, long-term collective problem without a decent solution, and I would agree, electric cars are not a decent solution. Hybrids, though, are very, very popular with voters. So again, I think we're drawing a little bit too absolute conclusions by just saying climate change has a salience problem. The second problem we have is that this issue has become very partisanly polarized. And so 80% of Democrats say that the trade-off, the environmental trade-offs are worth the economic costs. And 74% of Republicans say that the environmental payoffs are not worth the economic costs. So you come in having alienated about 41% of the population because this issue has become very, very partisanly polarized. Framing climate change as a threat is really, really good for fundraising, and that's why it appears to dominate. It's really good for social media clicks. It's really good for building followers on social media. It's really good for having activists respond to you positively, but it is demobilizing. You can't scare people you can scare them into giving you money, but you can't scare people straight. Fear produces fight or flight, and complexity is overwhelming. So people need to know, one, that solutions are possible. Telling people that they only have 10 years and it's all over, and giving them no example of a small-scale solution, and Ruth, I want to adopt your language, demobilizes everyone but core activists. We need to make solutions seem possible. We need to show examples of small changes that made a difference. We need to show an example of coming together and making that difference. We need to message from an asset framing, not a deficit framing. And we need, in particular, to overcome cynicism. Opposition is much less of a problem for us than cynicism is, and people feel just absolutely overwhelmed. Then there are the trade-offs conversations. Americans like having it all, and they like having it all at once. Although there is an increasing perspective in everything from women's lives to climate change, that having it all at once is virtually impossible, really exhausting, and costs a lot of money. But we do want to say that we do want to get away from the winners and losers frame. We do want to truly solve problems and show the economic impact. And right now, we have a problem with that. You're not going to convince a coal miner or a petrochemical worker in Texas that they're going to get the same high-paying job for renewable or green energy that they have in coal and petrochemicals. We need to talk about a transition. And we promised this before, right? We've promised this from the days of the spotted owl. And those timber workers are still, and those timber communities are still really hurting, and really largely on their own. So we have to talk about general benefits, but we also have to paint the future message. We don't paint a future that is positive. We paint a future that is negative. No one's going to jump on board for a negative future. And besides, I love that statement about Martin Luther King didn't start his speech with, "I have a nightmare." I will also say that Martin Luther King didn't start his speech with, "I have a problem for you." Americans have lots of problems. They don't need yours. They don't need an extra one. Their kids are also hammering them, and their grandkids are hammering them about climate change. And many women in particular say that they get their view of climate change from their children or grandchildren. So we have to show, paint a picture of the future that is positive. Another saying that we have in our business from Anat Shanker-Osorio is that we often sell the recipe. As activists, we love to sell the recipe. We don't sell the brownie. People don't buy. Does Duncan's Heinz brownie mix or Ghirardelli brownie mix show you all the ingredients, like 2 broken eggs and a bar of margarine or butter on the front of the cover? No, they show you a beautiful iced brownie. We got to sell the brownie, not the recipe. Green lash is definitely a problem. There's no question about it. And it is big because it is perceived to be big because people perceive it to be loud. And loud trumps big in this case. Loud makes people think that things are big. For example, in another arena, we've done work on in factory towns, which are towns that have lost their manufacturing base, small towns. And we've hemorrhaged, as Democrats, we've hemorrhaged the vote there. These towns are about 50-50, Democrats and Republicans. But we went in and polled people and we said, how Republican do you think or Democratic do you think your neighborhood is, your community is? The Democrats said it's 60% Trumpers to 40% Biden people, 60% Republicans to 40% Dems. And the Republicans said the same thing, 65 to 35. We had controlled it for 50-50. But the Trumpers are loud, and so people think they're big. Loud and big are two different things. Greenwashing is also a big problem. We talk in this room about green lashing, but greenwashing is actually the bigger problem. That everybody is using the green solution and making people feel, well, like I'm doing my bit for this. The escalating tactics, I cannot wait for Omar's presentation. Of all of our presentations, honestly, that's the one I feel like I'm going to learn the most about because I want to understand, because there was a lot of escalating tactics in the Civil War, in the Civil Rights Movement. And let us remember that polling shows in the era of the 60s that the civil rights efforts would never have passed if they required a majority vote. So I'm not the expert, but I'm really interested in hearing the expert. But I will say that the tactics do two things that are negative. They may have a lot of positive benefits, and I can't wait for Omar to tell us. One thing they do is the way the press covers them, it's very often covered from a terrorist frame. So let me take another example. There was the Stonehenge example, but ABC's coverage of the congressional ball game being disrupted because it was Chevron sponsored. The self-described youth-led group Climate Defiance took credit for the protest and shared videos on X of protesters rushing the field, calling the Chevron-sponsored game unconscionable. That sounds like terrorism. That's how we report terrorist attacks. Now, maybe some of us believe these are terrorist attacks, but we need a different kind of coverage and a different kinds of positioning to have these tactics be successful. And then lastly, and I think we're going to have a lot of talk, and Rui is definitely an expert on this, of the blue-collar vote, it also sounds like privilege. It's hard to argue to working-class people who now in this inflationary era have to have 2.5 jobs to get by, that blocking traffic is making their lives better. So we often see them in the environmental movement, and we've returned to an era of seeing, rather than environmental justice, as seeing as a privileged movement, particularly even at some core constituencies, like the numbers have moved very rapidly among African Americans, for example. So I think there are lots of challenges, and I think there are lots of things that are raised here that are very important points, but I would argue sometimes the conclusions that we're making are not the correct conclusions. And Omar, I can't wait to hear your comments.
Yeah. Thank you, Celinda. We now will hear from Omar, and I do think this analogy to the civil rights movement is pretty key, because I hear it all the time. We heard it from Sierra Club gentlemen earlier, and I had a interesting discussion/debate with Margaret Salomon, who's head of the Climate Emergency Fund, which basically funds Just Stop Oil and so on. And she kept on returning to this theme that, yeah, you say this turns people off when we glue ourselves to paintings or, throw paint on the Stonehenge, but this is how we get people's attention. And, the civil rights movement was not popular either. People hated them to begin with. So really, what we're doing is just like all social movements have done. This is sure to succeed. Just, stick with it. So, Omar, give us the benefit of your research and insight on this.
I want to begin by thanking BTI for having me. It's a real honor to be here. I also want to thank David Shore, who generously has written about my work and was treated quite badly for that, and was incredibly gracious throughout. And I think a real when I went through some of the kind of back and forth, was really impressed at how thoughtful and kind and generous he was throughout those discussions. So I thank you for that. So every movement is a contest between expression and persuasion. And you've got these two profound kinds of human desires. Like, people are angry. They are grieving. They have some kind of grievance they want to convey. And at the same time, there are often like practical demands. There's some interest we have we want to achieve. And those can work, those can be in tension. And I, having been the child of people who are active in the civil rights movement, was really interested in what kinds of things allowed a protest movement, a social movement to be effective. And just to kind of fast forward, like ended up spending about 15 years studying the civil rights movement and sort of differential effects of certain kinds of tactics. So to start, is there a clicker? So let me give a little bit of context here. I'm giving you just 3 slides and just raw data, no statistical analyses. But there's a debate about social movements, right? And one argument is that protests are ineffective; they do nothing. Another kind of argument is, only really kind of highly disruptive protests are effective, or maybe only nonviolent protests are effective. And I'm not going to go into kind of all the details of these different kinds of debates, but in political science, an argument is that basically elites dominate political communication and that bottom-up effects are essentially, there's very little evidence of mass movements having any effect at all. Okay? So in this plot, you're looking at the x-axis is clearly time over about a 30-year period. The y-axis is percentage of people saying a particular issue is the most important problem. There are a variety of issues that are put into 4 buckets. So if people said, juvenile delinquency was a problem, that got put in social control. And what you can see is that in the first part of the plot, the first half, foreign affairs, the Cold War dominates. But there's a big dip in the early 60s where we see civil rights spike, and a majority of Americans are saying civil rights is the most important problem in America. So that's broadly inconsistent with the story that says protests are ineffective, right? The civil rights movement was able to punch through in a period of the Cold War and make civil rights the most important problem in America. But importantly, if your argument is that nonviolence is all that matters, it's hard to explain some of the later curve where we look at this orange social control curve. There's a period in the late 60s, early 70s where concerns about crime, riots, juvenile delinquency rise and become the most important problem in America, right? And so I was trying to figure out, how can we better explain some of these patterns? Again, this is a very simple plot, just raw data. And let me explain again the axes, right? Y-axis here is year, x-axis is year. On the left, we have a y-axis that says the number of protesters per month, and those are the circle dots, the little, and so what you've got is a kind of a measure of protest activity. How much protest activity, and again, this is just civil rights protest, it's not Vietnam protest, it's not other free speech protests. And then the green line is we've just zoomed in on that. The first plot had percent of people saying most important problem. So that's the same now on the right y-axis, percent saying civil rights is the most important problem. So that's the same data. And what you can see, and again, this is like, there's no statistical analysis here. This is just raw data. We see a spike in concern about civil rights around the 1960 Civil Rights Act. So there is an elite effect, it seems. Like when there is legislation, 1964 Civil Rights Act, there's a spike. When there's elite action, there does seem to be a spike in opinion. But importantly, in 1963, around the March on Washington, the highest dot, 250,000 people converge on Washington, D.C. New York Times calls it the greatest movement for redress of grievances the country has ever seen. And they say in that lead paragraph, notably, there was no violence to mar the events, right? Like the sort of presence or absence of violence is often a defining aspect of how these things are framed. We see another spike around 1965 where Selma happens. Famously, John Lewis and others are beaten by state troopers and vigilantes on the Edmund Pettus Bridge. As a kind of just side note, that happens by coincidence. There's a national broadcast, and I believe it's ABC, about the Nuremberg trials, and they break into the Nuremberg trials movie and cut to the Edmund Pettus Bridge and show this kind of like domestic fascism against civil rights protesters, right? So it's just a galvanizing moment, and you see this really dramatic spike and fall, another spike around the Voting Rights Act, and so on, right? So plausibly evidence of, if your hypothesis protests do nothing, we have some, I think, reasonable evidence that protests are moving public opinion. And as was just discussed, and I show this in other work I'm not going to show today, but a protest today is generating, a nonviolent protest today is generating a headline on a front page newspaper that mentions civil rights. I looked at 250,000 headlines across 8 newspapers in this period, right? So a nonviolent protest today produces a headline about civil rights or voting rights. But if we look at protests where there's protester-initiated violence, so this is 1964 to 1973, again, hundreds of protest events. Now I'm using the log of violent protest arrests as a measure of like protest activity, how much like on-the-ground activity is there. And I take the log here just because there's some events that are vastly larger than others, and so to kind of put it on a more readable scale. And then again, I'm zooming in on that was the social control line, percent saying social control is the most important problem is the right y-axis. And I want to step back for a second here. This plot, and again, this is like a kind of simple, like not particularly sexy looking plot, but this was in some ways the moment when I kind of knew I had a research, like I'd found something, right? And why was that? I had been looking at this public opinion data for a long time, and as you can see, it sort of bounces around. And public opinion data, as these folks know better than I do, is often noisy. And so for a long time when I was looking at this, I thought, well, you just got this like noisy public opinion data on concern about social control, where again, social control is crime, juvenile delinquency, riots. And so, it's noisy. And then I kind of plotted the protest, this violent protest data with the public opinion data. And after studying it for a while, I was like, oh, you know what? There's actually a structure here, right? And so the first order of the structure is it's going up in the summer and down in the winter. And if your story about concern about something like social control is that it's driven by, say, racism, which is like non-trivially a factor, you'd have to have a reason why like anti-black affect is seasonal, right? It's more durable, but it's not like the whole story here, right? And there are other things, like we have 1965, Watts Uprising is one of the largest violent protests in American history, 3,000 incidents of arson, more than 36 people killed, in part, many of them by police and National Guard. But it's early, right? There's a small spike in 65, and there's sort of this building shift in public opinion where this issue becomes more salient as there are more of these big events where there is significant, again, injury. I'm not talking about how these terms are defined, but injury, property damage, death. Significant injury, property damage, death, arson are the ways in which a violent protest is defined. So all to say, and I'll begin to wrap, that we see this shift away from concern about civil rights to a concern about social control in this era of more extreme tactics, right? This is a kind of the later part of the civil rights era. And I want to be clear, like, there are lots of reasons to think violence might be moral, right? Violent resistance to the Nazis was like, to me, like, absolutely like a principled way to try and like defend one's freedom. In the context of like violent state repression, it might be that violence's response is legitimate. But what we also see is in a democratic society where you have these like multiple channels with which to, again, engage in this kind of redress of grievances, it may be that violence is moral but not strategic. So just to wrap, like two important things I think that are worth considering here. One is, so I've talked about how nonviolence was an effective tactic, but it's important to add a footnote to that. So one is that there's a great history of the media coverage of the civil rights movement called the race beat. And it has some powerful stories about how, the kind of the logic of the media in their coverage. And there's a vignette about a very large protest in Hattiesburg, Mississippi, largest nonviolent protest in that city. And the New York Times reporter is quoted in this book as saying, no blood, no guts, no story. Right? It wasn't enough to have a big nonviolent protest, and the civil rights leaders began to sort of iteratively figure this out, and so they began to pick places like Selma to organize protests because they knew that Bull Connor was going to engage in these spectacles of violence that would make them the targets of violence, which would help generate media coverage that was sympathetic. Right? So in fact, there was a strategic use of violence, but making themselves the targets of violence. Second thing is, I think it's useful, and this is sort of where I'm going, and I'll wrap in a moment, I think it's useful to think about protests as a kind of storytelling. There are good guys and bad guys, there are narrative arcs, there is sympathetic kind of representation or not. And I think at the heart of what the civil rights movement understood at its most kind of effective times was that each of these events was, John Lewis, Martin Luther King talked about, we're trying to dramatize injustice. They stage a protest. They were organizing protests between 9 and noon because footage needed to be flown to New York to be broadcast nationally. There was like intense attention to how do we construct a narrative, put children in front of cameras, in front of fire hoses, casting particular people for effectiveness. So all to say, there was a kind of process of constructing narratives to persuade that was particularly effective. And the last thing I'll say is it wasn't just about, I think, telling stories at a kind of superficial level, but getting back to the leverage plot that we saw earlier. It was about altering mindsets, trying to change kind of the deep stories people have about what is normal and what is natural and what is acceptable. Thank you.
Yeah, that was great, Omar. I think we'll dig a little bit more into this analogy to the civil rights movement and sort of full of different tactics. But first I wanted to get into the salience issue a little bit more. David, what did you think about what Celinda had to say about in a way she was almost saying salience problem is like sort of a non-problem. It's salient enough to enough different sort of slices of voters and the relationship of that to mobilization that it's actually like, pretty potent. So what do you think about that?
Yeah, what I'll say, I agree with, in particular, she had a great analogy between climate change and reproductive choice, which is, if you look at the chart, reproductive choice also is pretty low right now. And that gets at issue salience is very different, I think, than other public opinion time series that you look at, in that partisanship doesn't change very much, vote choice doesn't change very much, but what issues people care about, that changes a lot, on a week-to-week basis. And that's literally why Omar was able to actually do it. That you saw in the graph. Everything went around. And so I think it is possible, in a way that isn't true for other things, to make the public care about something. And it just kind of, the question is whether doing that is good or bad. I think, when you're thinking specifically about mobilization, though, I do think there is an answer where I think that climate change is legitimately very mobilizing for very liberal young people. And if you want to have a very targeted strategy specifically for very liberal young people, that's fine. But they are only maybe 12% of very young voters. And so I don't know. I think that it is a situation, like if you talk about climate change the right way, if you like raise the salience of Republicans are polluting rivers and we want to do clean air and clean water, I think that's great. But we had a lot of these negative examples, and I really worry that the actual messaging that a lot of these groups the climate groups are using when they try to go and raise the salience specifically tests very poorly. If you had, I don't know, radical action for clean air, that would be a little different, maybe. But
Yeah, so your view, in a way, it sounds like on net, raising the salience in the way that the climate movement has tried to do is, it has some mobilizing effects, but the net is maybe negative. But if it was approached in a different way, perhaps it could be, a win-win, as they say.
It could, and I'll say, one other thing, which is, I think it's great, that activists are trying to raise the salience of different issues. It has pros and cons, but sometimes it's good, sometimes it's bad. But I do think if you are 4 months away from the election, it is true that
there's an election coming up.
Apparently,
right?
yeah.
We're not getting into that here.
Yeah, thank you. I just think at some point you have to look at what, I think if you're 2 years out, you can try to shift and shape the electorate to be what you want. But at some point, if you're running a presidential campaign, you have to look at what are the top issues that people care about now. And you don't have to base all of your campaign on it, but I think at some point you have to look at the electorate as it is, as opposed to how you might want it to be.
Yeah, fair enough. So Linda, you have any comments on
I actually agree with a lot of what David said.
You agree. This is great.
What David said. Can I ask a point of personal privilege? Omar, I would love to know what would have been different about the strategies and the impact of the civil rights movement if they had had social media?
So, I think it's important. So it's a great question, and I think it's important to appreciate that we have a fragmented media in the 1960s. Right. There is a pro-segregation press in the South. There is an anti-segregation black press, and there is a sort of indifferent national white press. And so some of what we see in this hyper fragmented media today exists in part in that era, and the kind of some of the core logic of how the civil rights movement worked remains, I think, true in the era of social media. So Darnella Frazier is a 17-year-old teenager who has the presence of mind to take out her phone and document the killing of George Floyd, and that is different in that she is not like ABC or NBC with a news crew, and so there's this kind of distributed power in now everybody has a camera and can document something that's happening around them. In the civil rights era, they really needed these traditional news networks to show up. But the core logic of a visual representation of a profound injustice can move people, I think, remains in some ways the same, right? And that's I think at some core level, humans respond to a certain kind of narrative power. And that was true then and is true now. Maybe one important difference is there's a kind of saturation effect. We're getting more of these stories, and I think people may become a little desensitized in the present moment with social media. But I think the 2020 example suggests that there's still a power for a certain kind of imagery to really punch through and get people to pause and say, wow, that feels unacceptable.
Well,
So
Omar,
one
let
of
me
the
ask
things-
you.
And to be clear, that was posted to Facebook, right? That's it's both the power of the camera and the power of distribution. Sorry.
So one of the things I think is interesting here, two things that I think are interesting. I believe if we had been talking for a long time about carbon pollution and the poisoning impact of carbon pollution, and that carbon pollution is being dumped in your community, we would have had a lot more movement than climate change. To tell people that the earth is boiling is to just demobilize them. There was a very famous experiment in the crime area where Nixon had put on ads that were showing a young woman walking in an alley and then being raped, although you didn't see the rape, obviously. And then Nixon came on for crime. And it didn't move his numbers on crime at all in the testing. And the reason it didn't is women in particular were so focused emotionally and hung up on the emotions of that predatory rape. They didn't even get like who was doing what. I mean, I was kind of focused on the woman. So I emphasize that you can't scare people straight. I also think some of the lessons from the civil rights movement, and you are by far the expert, but I have studied that movement a little bit in terms of how they went back to values. Like many of the civil rights movement activists wanted to carry communist flags in their marches. And Martin Luther King said absolutely no pictures of communist flags, absolutely no communist flags. Everybody has to carry American flags. And they would hand out American flags. They put children, they said, they talked to the reporters and they said, we want children in every picture. There was a reason Birmingham was the Children's March. And again, other people may be more expert on this, but there was a real understanding of how to engage values. And I think we just think that another statistic, I mean, like 1.5 degree warming, really? I mean, I don't even turn on my air conditioning for a 1.5 degree increase in warming. Like, that's a lot. I mean, people are terrible at math, okay? This is a basic principle. And so the way that we talk about this doesn't have the emotional and iconic kinds of coverage. The other thing that Martin Luther King they tried very hard to do, all of the outlets, the northern outlets, were sending white reporters to the South because they were afraid of the death threats, et cetera, on any of their reporters, but particularly if they sent black reporters. Ebony was the one exception. Ebony sent a black reporter, which was game-changing in terms of some of the coverage. But the civil rights movement was pushing. You have to, and it's to your point, Ruth, actually, I think, this ground up versus ground down. You've got to send black reporters. Only if black reporters come will we really get the emotional understanding that we want in what we're trying to do here. So I think there are a lot of lessons about how the civil rights movement used values and emotions and symbolism. And in some ways, the climate change movement is almost doing the reverse. Like throwing paint, I mean, most young people don't even want to go to a museum. Throwing paint on a painting that nobody knows, and you know, very few people have seen. Well, maybe that's guerrilla action, but I doubt it.
Let me follow up on that a little bit because it does raise an interesting question to me. You know, if you look at the sort of most important problem curve for climate change, it's basically flat line near the bottom, despite all the there have been enormous nonviolent marches too, right? There's certainly enormous media coverage. There's certainly a lot of sort of pushing of the certain line that's borderline catastrophist by a lot of media and intellectuals and so on, and yet it doesn't change. Now, how much does this have to do with the rhetoric, perhaps, and maybe the tactics of the climate movement? If they had been different, maybe that salience wouldn't have stayed flat line near the bottom. Is it that flexible? I'm just curious if you have a reaction to that.
Well, let me say something quickly that picks up on what David said, and I'm curious to hear you. I sort of dream of a kind of like selfish environmentalism that says you want clean air, right? And there's like a coalition, like part of the logic of the civil rights movement was how we are 10% of the population. We are a despised minority. How do we build a 50+1% governing majority, right? And like, because you're not gonna, in a majoritarian system, 10% is not gonna get you your interests served, right? And so it's like, I am curious about like what are the issues that get you a governing coalition? And something like clean air, I mean, you referenced this before, is like, I'm a runner. I think a lot about running near freeways, right? I've lived in LA where it's like the air is better, but it's still often terrible, right? And if you're somebody who has a grandparent with like, a health issue, or maybe you're somebody in your family has asthma, or maybe they're newborns in your family, there's a governing coalition, a governing majority around clean air. And and it turns out, if you fight for cleaner air, you're fighting fossil fuel emissions. You're getting the goal you want, but through a different means. And I think there was just a level of attention in the civil rights era to like, how do we find issues that get us our interests, but that also get us the governing coalition, the governing majority we need. And I think too often on the expression side of what I see in climate, it's sort of like, no, we care a lot about this issue rather than how do we get what we want through the process of building a winning majority.
Fair, David?
Yeah, I want to not shit on the climate activists too much in that,
Okay.
I want to push back in that, the line wasn't flat. There was a dramatic increase in the salience of climate amongst liberals and amongst Democrats, over the course of the 2010s. It really peaked around, January of 2020, and then it collapsed, during COVID, and George Floyd and all of the other things. But I do think the sum total of all actions that everybody in climate did made climate the single most important thing among Democratic policy elites. And the way it works is that liberals get to pass one policy every 14 years on average, and we decided that's just how it works. And you could imagine, and there are a lot of people who wanted their different things. If you talk to the CBC, they probably wanted the child tax credit, but the climate people did successfully convince white, very liberal people that climate change should be that one thing, and then that's the thing that happened. And I think some of the activism was probably counterproductive, but it was a successful thing. They did win.
Also they were in the right place at the right time, in a sense. Maybe the tactics worked, right? Maybe catastrophist framing within that short, sort of that particular period of time actually paid off, and maybe just it doesn't work now. Is that what you'd say?
I don't know. I mean, my guess, much like I guess every social movement, there probably were a lot of things that were dumb. But if you look at the sum total, it did happen. Maybe I think now the case is probably a little different. Like the bill has been passed. We're not the prospects that, I think, he was talking about governing majority stuff, and I think that there is a path for lobbying where you say, all right, I'm gonna be really scorched earth, so that the very liberal policy elites will put me at the top of their agenda, and then we get a trifecta and we pass a bill. We're probably not going to have a big trifecta and pass any sweeping legislation, in the near future. And that means that, it's suddenly very important to get conservatives to like your stuff, and I think the trade-offs are different now, but it might have been, the prospects were different in 2017, I don't want to judge people too much.
Sure.
Well, I think also people have been following with more than their votes. People have been following, and they're getting bribed, if you will, by greenwashing, but people are engaging in a lot of climate change consumer behavior, or at least they think they are. I mean, the electric cars, and I totally agree with you, David, the electric cars numbers are being brought down by people who are, women in particular, are abjectly terrified of running out of electricity in the middle of the road. But hybrid cars are very, very popular. Solar, if you take an aerial view of Washington, D.C., the single biggest and solar is really on the rise in Washington, D.C. Single biggest predictor is whether your neighbor has solar. If your neighbor has solar, then it pops like that. So people are doing things with consumer behavior that they're not necessarily doing at the ballot box, in part because they don't think they have any good choices. Who's got the simple solution? Who's got the next simple step forward? How would you vote climate change right now, honestly? It's impossible to vote given the way that it's been framed.
Yeah, wow, okay, so I think we sufficiently complicated this issue. A lot of nuances here. I think you guys have a lot to chew on, but I think we're out of time, so I'll turn it over to the audience. If anybody could possibly have any questions, I was completely lucid here. Right over there.
We're running a little low on time, so let's take maybe one round of questions.
How many questions?
One round.
One round, okay, so
maybe 3 or 4.
maybe it takes several questions at once?
Yes, please.
Okay, all right, so.
And then we'll allow the panel to respond.
Right, okay, one there, you right there. Yeah, you.
I need a microphone.
Oh, okay. Oh, is somebody going to give you a microphone? Okay. So you, and then we'll figure out some other people.
Andy Revkin here. I've been trying to make sense of this stuff for a long time. I've interviewed both Rob Willer at Stanford and Dana Fisher. They're two sociologists who have very different views of what's called the radical flank effect, which is that the Stonehenge throwers and Margaret Salamon's funding Dana says, it is working because you get someone like Jeremy Strong to say something about caring about climate change when you invade his play. Rob Willer says it only works if your audience thinks about the environmental movement as having a flank and having something else as well. And for climate, he says there's no evidence that the average person knows not everyone is a Stonehenge paint thrower, that you can actually get involved with climate in a different way. So what's your take on that, you guys?
Right, okay, let's take a couple more.
Actually, it was substantially the same question. Like, is there anything positive about receiving negative attention from throwing orange paint or orange flour? Right? We've all talked about it. It's come up every single session I've been in. This entire dialogue, we've talked about the Stonehenge thing. It's clearly put it on the map, and it's kept the conversation going in a way which, wonkery stuff clearly doesn't. So, is there a positive outcome that can come from even achieving substantial negative attention?
Okay, one last question, maybe over there in the front row, on the, right over there, yeah. So, alas, we can't get all your questions in, but.
Hi, so my question is just, is it even possible to exercise the kind of message discipline you're talking about in the age of kind of the democratization of like social media or whatever? Like, there are a bunch of people who will talk often about needing more discipline within climate, and there are people who have a lot of credibility within the climate space or within racial justice spaces, or, notably within Gaza, you have a lot of people who've been working on the issue of Palestinian freedom, and they say, we don't want to do boycotts in Starbucks, it's not actually helping, but still it's very, very difficult to exercise discipline on a movement that's really distributed in this way, even if you have really strong issue groups that want that to happen. So is it just futile, or is there some actual movement out of this you can see happening?
Yeah, great question. Okay, well, let's go down the line here. First David, then Selena, then Omar, some reactions to the questions.
No, I'll respond to Jerusalem's question, which is, I hear this a lot, and I'm sure that it is true to some extent, but I think that we imagine that these networks, of these activist networks, are a lot more decentralized than they actually are. In reality, most of the time, they're all getting money from a very small group of funders, and so I guess I'll just say that real message discipline has never been tried. I do think that obviously you cannot get to zero, but I think that right now the incentive structure, if you want to make a career as an activist, is that it is in your interest to do something really dumb and counterproductive, and then that gets you more money and more, whatever. And, look, there's like less than 100 people who are cutting checks to these people. They could all collectively agree to do something different, and I think that up to now, they haven't. Hopefully that changes. But I do think this is a much more elite-driven activity than people give it credit for.
Selena?
I think David makes a really good point. I would say this, I'm struck by your question and your point. Everybody knows, all you have to do is say the Stonehenge paint, and everybody knows, everybody can fill it in. So I think there is an agenda-setting function. My problem is there's nothing at the end of the agenda. Like, if you get motivated, that draws your attention, what do you do next? I'm not going to go throw paint in the East Gallery in Washington, D.C. or something. So what do I vote on? What do I do next? Mm-hmm. I think the simple solution is not very clear to people. The second thing I would say is I think it's really different for people under 40. And this is why I'm really interested in the social media. One thing people under 40 want to do, it's not just a governing majority. They're so cynical about voting. They want something else to do. So it may be that this kind of radical activism, if it were coupled with, and by the way, go for this bill. Martin Luther King and the Civil Rights Movement always coupled it with what they wanted done legislatively, et cetera. They had eyes on the prize. And I think that the radical activism in the climate change world isn't necessarily coupled with doable political action.
Omar, comments?
So two quick thoughts. So one is, I think there probably is a kind of an ideal point in tactics where some amount of violence or disruption or arson might be useful in a small amount at the beginning of a movement to
Carefully
generate
titrated, yeah.
Yeah. No, it's like when there were protests around George Floyd, the Minneapolis police station went up in flames, and the entire country was paying attention, right? That was this bat signal to the world. People are really, really angry, and were it possible to kind of and in some ways this is what happened. The next 10,000 protests were overwhelmingly peaceful. you can potentially get some of the like attention-grabbing effect of this sort of non-normative disruption with the then like no, this is like a broad coalition on behalf of some issue. I think it's exceedingly hard to Jerusalem's point to like manage that kind of message discipline, and so it's probably better on average to be performatively nonviolent. But I think there is some evidence of a kind of like, you want to get everybody's attention, like some amount of non-normative disruption helps. Rob Willer, whose research I didn't mention, but does experimental work that finds these extreme tactics, though on average, have an alienating effect. People disidentify with a movement that's engaging in extreme tactics. So that's, I think, like a broad challenge for those kinds of tactics. And then a last point, and this is in some ways a point of sympathy for the challenge of any movement in the shadow of the civil rights era, is that there's a kind of symmetry, which is that we are fighting for the rights of black people to be treated as equal citizens in America, and what you are seeing in these photographs and this video imagery is a representation of that inequality. Right? And so like the activism enacted the second-class status for people to see. And it's much harder to kind of create that single image around something like air quality. It's much harder to create that single image around something like 1.5 degrees, right? And but I think Celinda's exactly right. Like the throwing paint on Stonehenge does not. What is the moral of that story? Right? Like, what is the takeaway for you as like, how does that connect back to climate? And at the core level, it doesn't. And at the same time, I think part of the challenge of good theater, right? I mean, groups like ACT UP were able to do things like put a condom over Jesse Helms' home as a kind of humorous theater that drew attention to the ways in which Jesse Helms was, not only disregarding the lives of people with AIDS, but causing real harm. And so there are ways that people can, again, dramatize injustice, but it takes real care and intention, and there's something almost kind of lazy about these like things that get attention, that are vandalism, that are where there's no moral to the story.
Yeah, very good, very good. I completely agree. I agree with everybody. So this has been a fantastic panel. Thank you all. And on to the next thing.
Book that you said about
Thank you, everyone.